Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Tonight, we continue our holiday reading of Tinsley's 1869 Christmas Annual, 13 at Table, the story of a dinner that was never eaten. The story plays out a bit like an old-fashioned murder mystery. 13 people receive unexpected letters inviting them to the reading of a will and the distribution of an inheritance. The characters are wildly different, and each part of the story explains the characters and their backstories as they take this sudden journey. This is the fourth video in the series. If you haven't listened to the first part, you can use the link on screen now or in the description below to get caught up. Because each part introduces a different character, they don't have to be listened to in order, but the first part provides the context for what follows. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Of an old gentleman who came all the way from Bermondsey. Down in one of the many narrow Bermondsey streets leading riverwards, where lofty warehouses rear themselves into the smoky air, there was a great block of buildings, a story taller than any others thereabouts, and, if possible, a shade dirtier, on the doorposts of which were inscribed the names of Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, Goodchap, and Co., and, judging from appearances, a thing we are proverbially told never to do, and which, in consequence, we are always doing, a capital business Messrs. Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, Goodchap, and Co. did. All the elements of wealth were to be found in that narrow Bermondsey street. There was the dust, the dirt, and the griminess. There was the bustle, the hurry, and the scampering. There were the big carts blocking up the thoroughfare, and a perfect army of shouting and perspiring porters and warehousemen who were forever letting something down from the top story to the street, or pulling something up from the street to the top story. They were in the fancy goods line, were these gentlemen, whose names were to be seen so frequently recurring about the premises, for Messrs. Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, Goldchap, and Co. displayed their lengthy patronymics on most of their available property, on their doorposts, as aforesaid, in white letters on a black ground, over their offices, neatly engraved on brass plates, on the top of their warehouse in black letters 4 feet high, in order that those who ran might read, and on all their carts, packing cases, boxes, crates, and hampers, so that it was no easy matter for a stranger to walk through Bermondsey at any time of day without becoming conscious of the existence of the firm of Messrs. Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, Goldchap, and Co. The career of the firm, from the day, many years back, when the warehouse was of small dimensions and the clerical staff consisted of a man and a boy, up to the time when it rose to its marvelous prosperity, had been full of strange vicissitudes. Mr. Alexander Davis, whose name stood first on the lengthy list, though at the head, was by no means the founder of the firm. Indeed, when as plain Sandy Davis he started from the miserable cottage in the north, which it was a mockery to call house, to walk up to London, after the proverbial fashion, with the proverbial 4 pence halfpenny in his pocket, nobody ever expected him to be the founder of anything at all. Indeed, if the truth be told, there were not wanting kind friends who prophesied Newgate and ultimately the gallows for the young ne'er-do-well, who, in his native town, had, at the early age of 13, made for himself a reputation for sharpness which many financiers and assurance office directors might have envied. Sandy Davis, at the outset, bid fair to realize his friend's predictions. Ill luck dogged him steadily in his start in life. Out of his slender capital the halfpenny proved to be bad, and led him into some difficulties with a small shopkeeper. He sprained his ankle, he caught the fever, and, about halfway to the south, he got a week in prison as a vagrant. But Sandy was a lad of indomitable perseverance, and never lost the great object he had in view, viz., London and a fortune. For, by country lads with the exact sum of 4 pence halfpenny, the two always go together. And he walked and rode if he got the chance, which was but seldom, and in the end, one fine afternoon, he trudged into London, very tired, footsore, very hungry and dirty, very ragged and disreputable. Guided by instinct, he wandered into the city, and the sight of the wealth and prosperity around him acted as a reviver to his drooping spirits and weary limbs, and he cried, as all such youths have cried from Dick Whittington downward, "I, too, will be one of these merchant princes." Having made this resolve, he did not at the moment see what further steps could be taken toward amassing a colossal fortune, so he seated himself on a stone step and wished for a pennyworth of bread. In those days Sandy Davis was not above begging. Indeed, in after life he rarely lost anything for want of asking, and, as he rested on the step, he kept a sharp lookout for any benevolent old gentleman who might be touched by his tale of distress. But benevolent old gentlemen were scarce that day. Moreover, everybody appeared to be in such a hurry and bustle that Sandy doubted whether he could get anyone to listen to his woes told in broad Scotch. As time went on, however, the pangs of hunger increased, and the lad, having marked down a middle-aged man, a trifle more benevolent-looking than the others, and in a trifle less hurry, he darted after him. The old gentleman was in the act of drawing out his handkerchief as Sandy came up behind him, during which he jerked out a pocket-book of plethoric appearance, which Sandy immediately seized. The thoughts of men are secrets, and we will give the lad the benefit of the doubt by supposing he would instantly have returned it to the owner had he had the chance, but the gentleman upon whose benevolence he had been counting, happening to turn just at that moment, saw his pocket-book in Sandy's hands and instantly collared him, shouting, "Police!" Nobody paid any heed to the boy's remonstrances and excited statements, so Sandy was marched off to the station house, and the next day got 6 months' imprisonment for picking pockets. It so happened that a gentleman driving by to London Bridge, on his way to the Continent, had seen the whole transaction, and it further happened that, luckily for Sandy, he chanced some months later to be glancing over an old file of English newspapers in a hotel in Naples, and his eyes lighted upon a short report of a trial in which a certain Mr. Wadlove, a merchant of Bermondsey, persecuted a lad named Alexander Davis for stealing, or attempting to steal, a valuable pocket-book. The travelling gentleman rode off at once to Bermondsey and gave his account of what he had witnessed, which entirely corroborated Sandy's story. The letter arrived in England only a week or two before the expiration of the term of imprisonment, but Mr. Wadlove, who, after all, was a benevolent man, went off at once and, by dint of perseverance, procured the lad's release. And then, as the best atonement he could make, offered him the post of errand-boy in his counting-house at a salary of 7 shillings a week and with the right of sleeping under the counter. And from that time Sandy trudged steadily along the road to fortune. Davis had not failed to profit by certain lessons he had learnt while in jail. Never endowed with what people are pleased to term high moral principles, his compulsory residence amongst rogues and vagabonds had thoroughly imbued him with the notion that the only thing in the world to be dreaded was being found out. Moreover, being a sharp lad, he arrived at the further conclusion that the crime of peculation was, as a whole, so clumsily managed that discovery was inevitable, but that, for a sharp lad who had his wits about him, there was a wonderful career open in the form of systematic embezzlement. Not theft, mind. Davis had not the courage for that. He dared not run the risk, but for what certain folks nowadays call sharp financing. In short, he made up his mind never to neglect an opportunity of turning the penny without troubling himself as to whether it was particularly honest one or not. Davis saved money, and as he saved he invested, and a very fine thing he made of it. He was a very good servant to Wadlove, and next to his own interests looked after his master's, so that from errand-boy he became junior clerk. Then he was promoted to a post of trust in the warehouse, and finally, when his employer was getting old, he found himself occupying the seat of honour in the counting-house as managing clerk. Shortly after this, Wadlove most obligingly departed this life, leaving a widow to carry on the business, and Davis, being a man of business, with a purse in place of a heart, looked upon the widow Wadlove as a lucrative investment in the matrimonial line. After a decent time he proposed, and was accepted. The name of Waterloo was painted out and the name of painted in, and so the foundation of the great firm of Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, Goodchap and Co. was laid. Davis was left a widower in the course of a couple of years, and, being now a rich man, he felt he could afford to cultivate the affections, so looked about for a second wife. He had not much difficulty in finding a pretty, empty-headed girl with a taste for dress and show and fashion, who was willing to become Mrs. D in consideration of luxuries which she could not hope otherwise to enjoy. She married him, and bitterly he repented of his bargain. His second wife was the moral attached to his story, showing that, though sharp practice and peculations may prosper for a while, they are sure to bring, in the long run, a terrible retribution. She took him away from Bermondsey and located him in a fashionable quarter of the town, where he had an hour's omnibus drive daily to his place of business. For though she made him keep a carriage, she rarely suffered him to ride in it, and what with balls, parties, and operas, she led him such a life of it that over and over again he regretted having devoted his attention to the tender passion. He could not stand his new life. It tired him out, and one morning they found him lying dead in his bed. So, for the second time, the great Bermondsey business was in the hands of a widow. Now, Davis's foreman had been a certain Mr. Chadbright. Rumor said that Mrs. D had been engaged to him in her early affectionate youth, but had thrown him over for the wealthier man. Be that as it may, Mr. Chadbright followed exactly in his late employer's footsteps by taking charge of the business on his decease and then marrying his widow. The name of Davis was not painted out, but the words "and Chadbright" were added, and so the second step was taken toward the construction of the great firm. With marrying the widow, Chadbright's likeness to Davis ceased. He neglected the business quite as much as his predecessor had attended to it. He encouraged his wife in all her extravagances, and strove to excel as a man of fashion, and succeeded in imitating all the expensive vices of his superiors, while he failed completely in attaining to any of their virtues. He went upon the turf and lost heavily. He neglected his wife. He made his way to the dogs at a remarkably rapid pace, with the result that at the end of 3 years he found himself in a most unpleasant predicament as regarded ready money. But Chadbright proved himself equal to the emergency. He advertised for a partner, and, as the prestige which had attached itself to the house under Davis's management had not yet had time to fade, he had little difficulty in meeting with a gentleman whose money exceeded his brains in quantity, who was willing to put a considerable sum into the business, and have his name painted upon the doorposts in conjunction with those of Davis and Chadbright. Shuttleworth was the capitalist's name. He had many accomplishments. He could play nicely on the flute, he was rather good at pen and ink sketches, and he could drink brandy and water almost as fast as anybody could pour it out for him. But he had money, there was no doubt about that. So Chadbright put up with the flute and the sketches and the brandy and water, and took him into partnership. In fact, entrusted him in a great measure with the management of the business. Indeed, Chadbright did not much care who managed it as long as he did not, so he went down to his country seat and enjoyed himself, and if anybody asked him anything about Bermondsey, he pretended he had never heard of such a place. Prompted by his wife, Chadbright tried to get into Parliament. He opposed a real live lord at the general election, unsuccessfully. This freak cost some money, you may be sure, and before very long he found himself almost as badly off as he was before he took Shuttleworth into partnership, for Shuttleworth's flute-playing brought no trade to Bermondsey, and a caricature of his on the back of an invoice lost to the firm one of its best customers. "What we want is new blood," said Chadbright. "Let's have new blood by all means," answered Shuttleworth. They got the new blood in the shape of Mr. Goodchap, but they did not get much money, for although the new partner promised well, he performed badly. He was willing enough to put what money he possessed into the business, he said, but as he didn't possess anything worth mentioning, it didn't matter very much what he said on the matter. However, he managed to conciliate them by negotiating loans, so his name was added to the long list already painted on the doorposts, and the firm became Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, and Goodchap. It only wanted the co to complete it, and the co came in the shape of a very strange and unexpected person, and in an equally strange and unexpected manner. The co was no less a person than Mr. Waddelove, a grandson of the original founder of the business. He made his appearance at Bermondsey one morning when, by some strange chance, all the partners happened to be assembled there together, and introduced himself. "My grandfather," he said, "was offended with my father on account of his marriage. He disinherited him and never mentioned his name afterwards." "Thy grandfather's due in plays," observed Mr. Shuttleworth, making a rapid sketch on a blotting paper of a grandfather disinheriting his son. "I have lived all my life abroad," continued Mr. Waddelove, without noticing the interruption, "in great poverty, but—" "We've nothing for you, nothing," interposed Mr. Chadbright. "Will you have the kindness to hear me out? I was about to observe, in the last few years I have made a considerable sum of money." The partners became suddenly interested, and Mr. Goodchap took a bill stamp from his pocket and regarded first it and then Mr. Waddelove with much complacency. "I know the state of your firm. It can't last long in its present condition. I have come to offer you assistance." 3 months at the usual rate?" said Mr. Goodchap, seizing a pen. "No. I know the business well, and I know what can be made of it. If you like to take me in as junior partner and give me a voice in the management, I will put in a fair amount of capital." "What will you take to drink?" asked Mr. Chadbright. "Let's have a bottle of champagne." The partners took little pains to conceal the pleasure they felt at the prospect of fresh capital being introduced into their tottering business, and, as for a voice in the management, anybody who fancied it was welcome to manage the business, for, to tell the truth, it had in the course of the last 6 or 7 years got rather unmanageable, and the greatest scope for the display of talent lay in the ability with which pressing creditors could be put off. With one consent, Messrs. Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, and Goldchap proceeded to make out to their co that the firm had never been in a more flourishing condition, but young Waddelove pooh-poohed them. He knew very nearly as much of the state of the concern as they did, and was not to be taken in. In a short time Waddelove was installed as junior partner, but his name was not painted on the doorposts. He came in as the co, and he remained the co when all his partners had quitted the concern, and, as the co, he represented not only himself, but Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, and Goodchap. These worthies found that in the old man's grandson they had a straightforward, business-like young fellow to deal with, who put money into the business and, what was more to the purpose, would not suffer it to be drawn out by his partners in order that they might indulge their extravagant pleasures at his expense. The liabilities of the firm were enormous, and it took many years to pay them off, but by dint of hard work and close application he had managed, by the time he was a middle-aged man, to bring back the business to something like its original standing. Then a bit of luck happened to him. Shuttleworth, who had given up flute-playing and caricature drawing in order that he might devote the whole of his time to brandy and water drinking, died of his 5th attack of delirium tremens, and the firm had 1 partner less to support. But Chadbright still lived, and drew 3/4 of the profits yearly, till, one summer's day, seized with a business fit, he took it into his head to go over to Holland to see about a consignment of fancy goods. The steamboat, in returning, ran ashore on a sandbank. Luckily, the fancy goods were saved. Chadbright was not. Next year Waddelove bought Goodchap out of the business, and so it came about that the co was the only real representative of the firm of Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, Goodchap, and Company. And a very fine thing the co made of it, now that he was unfettered and could have matters exactly as he pleased. He was a clever man, a man who devoted all his energies, all his talents, and all his time to business. Moreover, he had marvelous luck. All his speculations succeeded, everything he touched turned to gold, and when he was an elderly man, bald and bent, he had amassed a fortune which he had neither the health nor the spirit to enjoy, and which he had not a notion how to dispose of after his death. for not a relative had he in the whole world save old White, who was older and richer than himself. Waddlove had run too long in one groove to be able to get out of it. Though he was as wealthy as many who live in castles and mansions, he still resided in 2 dingy rooms in the warehouse over the office, surrounded by his fancy goods, and a miserable, wretched life he had of it. As a young man he had had but one desire in life, and that was to restore his grandfather's business and reign supreme at the head of it. His desire was fulfilled, but instead of being a happy, contented man, he was a morose, gloomy cynic, disgusted with life and the world and everything in it. He had passed all his youth with no thoughts beyond his ledgers, and when at last he had leisure to mix with the world, he found it strange to him, so after 1 or 2 attempts he retired to his warehouse in disgust. For 18 months he had not been a quarter of a mile away from his place of business, and folks said he was going mad, and believed it too, until they tried to get the better of him in a bargain, when they found him very sane indeed. So, instead of calling him mad, they called him peculiar, and very peculiar he was. "He never as much as passed none of 'em the time o' day," as his foreman said. He rarely spoke, but when his voice was heard it was usually in tones of reproof, for his eyes were as sharp as ever, and he looked after the pence just as carefully as he looked after the pounds. And when young Waddlove became old Waddlove, this is what he was. He had made a fortune and wasted a life. One day, toward the close of the year, when great arithmetical feats were being accomplished with the books of Messrs. Davis, Chadbright, Shuttleworth, Goldshap, and Co., and wonders in the way of stock-taking were being enacted in the warehouses, Mr. Waddlove received the letter from old White's lawyer, announcing that gentleman's decease, and acquainting him that, as a relative of the late Mr. White, he would be entitled to a share of the money which the deceased gentleman had generously left behind him for division. "Bother," said Mr. Waddlove, when he had mastered the contents of the epistle. He had known old White by name only, never having visited him, and as for the money, he didn't want that, for he reckoned that at least 40 relations would be present, and therefore that the share of each would be but little. He really thought that he would not go. In fact, he made up his mind that he would not, but somehow or another he could not drive the matter from his mind. Old White and his money haunted him, and when the day named in the lawyer's letter for his attendance arrived, Waddlove astonished everybody in his warehouse by appearing in a new coat, declaring he was going out for the day. The counting-house was aghast, but Waddlove never troubled himself about what his clerks thought or said, and went off for a stroll from Bermondsey to the Strand, starting early in the morning, in order that he might make certain inquiries before keeping his appointment, for he had no notion, he said, of going to a dead man's house to be made a fool of. When he reached the city he was tired, for walking was an unusual exercise to him, and he looked about for a place to rest his weary limbs. Chance guided him to a mouldy old church, standing in a still, out-of-the-way yard, leading from a quiet, deserted-looking lane where the blindless windows of empty houses glared at each other like sightless eyes across the narrow street. Truth to tell, Waddlove knew very little about churches, and had not been inside one for years, but as well as his recollection served him, there was nothing to pay for admission, so, the door standing open, he entered the vault-like church, in which a dim religious light was obtained by the simple process of never cleaning the windows. He seated himself in the most comfortable pew he could find, and remained there unmolested for some 5 or 10 minutes, when a jaunty little man with a smirk and a pair of spectacles tripped over the stones of the aisle, and, approaching him, whispered in his ear, "We're waiting for you, sir." "It is very good of you," said Waddlove. "The lady's in the vestry, sir." "Bless my heart," said Waddlove. "You don't say so. What lady?" "Ain't you the bridegroom?" inquired the jaunty little man, his face lengthening till it hid his neck. "Bridegroom?" exclaimed Waddlove wrathfully. "Do I look like a bridegroom?" truth to tell, he did not, in spite of his new coat, and the little man retired abashed, in much haste apparently, dreading violence, while the Bermondsey merchant sat meditative in the pew. He was not a bridegroom, nor did he look like one, but that was no reason why he shouldn't be one some day. He had never before given the subject a moment's thought. He had hitherto looked upon marriage as a disease peculiar to young men, but for himself he never had time to consider the advantages of female society. Still, as he sat there resting in the pew, he came to the conclusion that he was old enough and rich enough to take himself a wife. Why should he not marry? At all events, the matter was worth further thought and some inquiry, and who better could furnish him with anticipatory matrimonial information than the expectant lady in the vestry? Coming out from the pew, he walked straight to the vestry door, knocked, was told to come in, went in, and found himself in the presence of somebody's bride-elect, who, in orange flowers and a flutter, sat awaiting the arrival of a tardy bridegroom. She was about 40 years of age, fairly well-looking, buxom, and with merry, sparkling black eyes that turned inquisitively upon Wadilove as he entered. "She'd do as well as anybody else," thought Wadilove. "I wonder, supposing the other fellow didn't turn up, if she'd have me." Just then the clock struck 12. "I'm very sorry, miss," said the jaunty little man who proved to be the clerk, "but you can't get married today nohow." "Can it be done by proxy?" asked Wadilove, thinking it would be good practice to be married for somebody else, and so gather experience while he shirked responsibility. "I wouldn't have him now if he came," said the bride-elect, comforting a lady friend who was shedding bitter tears after the manner of lady friends on the slightest provocation. "I admire your spirit, madam," said Wadilove. "May I speak a few words to you?" The ladies tittered. "I'm a bachelor, ma'am, but I have notions of matrimony. Before embarking in a speculation, I like to collect statistics, put facts down in the D and C side in a mental ledger, strike a balance, and decide on the course I mean to pursue." "How businesslike," chirped the two ladies. "I'm going to lock up," interposed the clerk. "Don't," said Wadilove, "but run out and bring back a couple of dozen oysters and a bottle of ginger wine into the vestry." The clerk demurred. He had a notion that turning a vestry into an oyster room was only 1 degree removed from sacrilege, but the happy thought occurring to him that he lived within a stone's throw, that he had a parlor quite at the service of the ladies and the gentlemen, got him well out of the difficulty, and the trio adjourned to a little room with a lively prospect over the churchyard, and discussed matrimony and oysters. "I think, ma'am," said Wadilove, "the balance is in favor of marriage." "And have you a lady in your eye?" asked the disappointed bride, sipping her ginger wine. "I have 2, answered Wadilove meaningly. "But you haven't proposed yet." "No, but if it is not taking too great a liberty—" Here Wadilove paused. He was on the point of proposing then and there, when he remembered that he had heard or read that people were in the habit of going down upon their knees when they made a formal offer. He hesitated. He was doubtful about being able to get down, and he was still more doubtful as to getting up again unassisted. So he had recourse to subterfuge and put the matter in a roundabout way. "My dear ma'am," said he, "suppose—mind, I only say suppose—you and I wanted to be married. Could it be done at once? Say, this afternoon?" "No, but it could early tomorrow morning," replied the bride with much alacrity. "It would be very good fun, wouldn't it?" said Wadilove. "Capital," answered the lady. "And it would serve the other fellow right. I mean the fellow who didn't come this morning, wouldn't it?" "It just would," said the lady. "I've a great mind to try," said Wadilove. "I would if I were you," advised the lady. Well then, ma'am, suppose we do get married tomorrow morning." "It's so sudden," said the lady bashfully. "But as I've got my trousseau already, it does seem a pity to waste it. And as for the other fellow, I could never bear to speak to him again. No, never, never, never." "Then," said Waterlove with a sigh, "may I hope?" "You'll have to get a special license and a ring," said the friend, tittering. "So I shall," answered Waterlove, and just at that moment the clock struck 5. Up to this time he had forgotten all about old White and his share of the legacy, but the chiming of the church bells reminded him that he had but an hour to get to the appointed place of meeting. "Business before pleasure, ladies," he cried, jumping up and putting his hat on and making for the door. "I really must leave you." "But sir, dear sir, I want to—" "Can't wait a moment, ma'am, but I'll write by tonight's post, and will come and see you first thing in the morning." "But, my dear sir, I don't even know your—" "I can't wait, ma'am, not a second, or I shall perhaps lose several £1,000." And the next moment he was gone. As Waterlove walked along the crowded streets, he felt well pleased with what he had done. He thought his success with these ladies showed a wonderful power of captivation, and, being an old man with no experience of Cupid's camp, he felt flattered. Yet still, as he walked on, and thought further how he was saddling himself with an encumbrance for life, he was inclined to doubt the wisdom of the step he had taken. "It's like buying a cargo of goods without seeing the invoice or the bill of lading," thought Waterlove. "What security have I that she will be according to sample? I wonder if I am an old fool after all." He walked on, and actually began to regret what he had done. "What do I know about her?" he soliloquized. "Nothing, absolutely nothing, beyond that she is Or say, didn't she say she was a widow? Beyond that she is Miss... Hang me if I can remember her name. Stay a moment, though, did I ever hear it? Why, no, I don't even know her name, and am quite sure she doesn't know mine, and I haven't a notion where she lives. The clerk doesn't know either, because I asked him." Mr. Waterlove became more and more meditative as he drew near the end of his walk. "I can advertise, of course," said he, "though it's expensive. The lady who lunched with the gentleman on oysters and ginger wine is earnestly entreated to send her address without delay, etc., etc. I wonder if it will be worth while. Yes, I certainly will advertise, though I don't know. On second thought, perhaps not. No, I really don't think that I will." And when Mr. Waterlove knocked at the door of the house of the deceased White at exactly 5 minutes to 6, he had definitely made up his mind to take no further steps on the matter, but to spend the remainder of his existence in single blessedness and... But more of this anon. Of a respectable couple who met with an accident on the Underground Railway. Most persons who have the pleasure of meeting with Mr. Gandy, when accompanied by Mrs. Gandy, must somehow find a suggestion of John Gilpin stealing over their minds. Not that there is any particular personal identity with, or even likeness to, any portraiture of the citizen of credit and renown who had an involuntary ride to wear, for Mr. Gandy, so far as bulk and bodily proportions go, would by no means fill Gilpin's riding boots. But the notion arises from association with Mrs. Gandy, who inevitably brings into one's mind the very ideal of Mrs. Gilpin. It is impossible not to feel sure, as you look at Mrs. Gandy, that she is a careful soul, that she has a frugal mind, even when on pleasure bent, and what is absolutely certain to arise when she and Mr. Gandy form a tableau is a conviction that, like her prototype, she is a master of every household situation, even if she did not say so, and frequently it would be perceived that she is a long-headed woman of an imperious temper and an adept in the science of henpecking. A portly person which overshadows and eclipses Gandy's wizened form is, on state occasions, intensified by dresses of heavy materials and pronounced colors. It is just doubtful whether, even when crinoline was worn, Mrs. Gandy needed that aid to the balloonism of her costume, and altogether, when she was in that condition of dress which, if one was speaking of an Indian, one could call her war paint, she was about as formidable a female to encounter in a crowd where she had to dispute her right of precedence as any meek man would wish to avoid. Now, though Mrs. Gandy was, in her own esteem, long-headed, she was by no means exactly clear-headed in particular circumstances. That organ, which phrenologists say indicates an aptitude for, so to speak, mentally mapping out localities and remembering their features and peculiarities after once seeing them, and which is to be taken as a specialty of all great military commanders, was singularly deficient in Mrs. Gandy. She was, in a remarkable degree, one of those remarkable ladies whose name is Legion, who are the amusement, or the annoyance, as the case may be, of omnibus conductors, inasmuch as they invariably desire to be taken to Hampstead in a vehicle that all eyes but their own can see is bound for Chelsea. But, as her tendency to locomotion was small, her inconveniences in this regard were in proportion, while, in the matter of railway travelling, her indisposition to trust herself to steam motive power amounted to horror. Tunnels were things of fear. The screeching of steam whistles was shocking to her tympanum as well as to her nerves. The obtaining of a ticket was a feat to which she had to bend up all her faculties, mental and corporeal, and in 9 cases out of 10 it was a wrong one, while its preservation to the end of her journey was a matter which to say was problematical would be to indulge in very inadequate phraseology. Now, it happened that these pains and penalties, whenever she had to undergo them, might have been spared to Mrs. Gandy, if she would only have followed the course of polite society, and let her male attendant, who was her husband, do all this kind of thing. For Gandy, though a quiet man, and subject to an enforced silence at all times in the presence of his wife, was shrewd and collected in his ways, and methodical in his habits, so much so that despite the contempt in which his spouse held his intellectual and business qualities, he had managed to accumulate a snug little fortune in a trade which need not be specified, since he had, at the time when he becomes an object of interest here, long retired from it. His means, however, were not so very great as to render him indifferent to any addition, and you may rest assured that he rejoiced exceedingly when one day a letter came from one Badger, Mr. Gandy's dead cousin's solicitor, to say that on a certain day at 6 p.m. precisely, at the deceased house in Low Tide Street, Strand, a large sum of money which the old gentleman had left behind was to be shared amongst his relatives there assembled. It may easily be conceived of the relative characters of this middle-aged couple, for it should be said that they were both past 40 and not yet 50, which is the nearest approximation to a revelation of their actual years which need be made, that, of all perils by rail which they could possibly have to encounter, those which might be met on the Underground Railway would be the most terrible. That line, as many a head-aching Londoner knows to his cost, is nearly 1 tunnel in all the length of the main line and its extensions. Half a dozen other lines debouch in its principal stations. Ticket offices are multiplied infinitely. Trains come in every 2 minutes, every one apparently independent of its predecessor and going to a different destination. With that curious facility for vocal mystification which seems to be part of the idiosyncrasy of the railway porter especially developed, no human ear can ever distinguish the names of the places to which the trains are going, as they are yelled shortly or muttered out gruffly by those whose business it is to guide the errant wayfarer to the carriage which should bear him to his destination. The first descent from the outer world into the abyss in which the line is constructed brings on so decided a change of thought and feeling and idea, there is so great a contrast to the light, and what might be called the smooth viability of the streets, that bewilderment is inevitable, and it is wonderful that entrance into the wrong train is the exception and not the rule. The distraction which is the normal condition of passengers at every station culminates at that of Farringdon Street. At most of the others there is diversity of train and divergence of route, but there the whole correspondence comes to one head. There is the point of departure for every destination in the whole known world. You may start for Baker Street or the Hudson's Bay territory, and it may happen that when you think that you have actually set out for Hudson's Bay, you find that you are compelled by a misadventure of tickets and ticket places to get out at Baker Street. Even in such a place, so wild, so confusing, so, in many respects, defectively arranged, were to be found on that eventful day when White's legatees were to comply with the condition of his will, Mr. and Mrs. Gandy. How it came about that Mr. and Mrs. Gandy had determined to travel by the Metropolitan Railway from Farringdon Street, near to which station they resided, is very easy of explanation. It was so seldom they went out together that, having to make a journey on the day of the distribution of old White's money, they determined, before going to the Strand, to call on a friend who lived near to the Edgware Road station. It was the wish of Mr. Gandy to go by the Underground Railway, no matter for what reason, and accordingly, when the mode of transit came, as of course it would, under discussion, his cue was to object as strongly as he could to any notion of going by the Metropolitan, and he dropped hints of darkness, mephitic atmosphere, and the absolute necessity of rapidity of movement in getting out of the carriage, a suggestion which was likely to fall with a certain point on Mrs. Gandy's ear. He proposed a hansom cab, a fly, which should also be a handsome one, although in a different meaning and orthography, an omnibus, and in his eagerness he was almost blurting out something about a bath chair drawn by a donkey. The astute Gandy gained his end. From the moment he would have none of the Metropolitan Railway, Mrs. Gandy would have none other conveyance, and hence they were in due time at the Farringdon station. Mr. Gandy had expressed an opinion that the proper hour to start was 3 o'clock. Consequently, he found himself under the stern guardianship of Mrs. Gandy at the station at 1. It happened on this occasion that there was an unusual crowd, and the divaricatory purposes of the would-be passengers enormous. This time Mr. Gandy did not put himself forward. He was anxious to get the tickets himself, and so he carefully did not offer to do so. For once his artfulness failed him. The taking of the tickets was a matter of business, and, as to trusting Gandy with that, it was out of the question. Their destination was the Edgware Road. Presently Mrs. Gandy found herself projected toward a ticket office, nearly the centre of a hustling throng, whose movements were calculated to test to the utmost the elasticity of Mrs. Gandy's joints. Flushed, flustered, indignant, she was thrust against the pigeonhole, and she asked for tickets without any distinct specification of the place which they were to indicate, and received such as a peculiarly nonchalant clerk, and that is saying a great deal, thought she required. It was not his fault that they were the right ones, but in fact they were. When, however, anyone has obtained the proper license to travel, which is not always a certainty, the difficulties of the metropolitan traveller are still before him, and in force, as they were in the case of Mr. and Mrs. Gandy. He has to get onto the proper platform, into the right carriage, and, by a fulfillment of the doctrine of chances that happens, he has to nerve himself up to a preternatural watchfulness in order to ascertain when he is at the station where he ought to get out, and there are besides other disagreements which tend to perplex and often to irritate the voyager on this line. On this occasion Mr. Gandy had his wits about him, and by a skilful device he satisfied himself that his wife had really obtained the right tickets, and then, on the wrong platform, he calmly awaited the arrival of the train. He was in no hurry, but Mrs. Gandy was, as ever, impetuous, and as soon as the train glided up to the platform on which they were standing, she darted forward, if she could be said to dart, and made for the first carriage, the door of which was open, nor cast one longing look at Gandy, who was, as she presumed, too well taught the habit of trotting behind her to need any looking after. But Gandy did not follow at once and rapidly. For a moment he was looking at, it must out, a very pretty girl who was amongst the bystanders waiting for trains, and so he did not miss Mrs. Gandy, and he thought the less about her because he believed that their hour and their train had not come. Presently, as his eye sought Mrs. Gandy, he beheld the train sliding away, and the head and umbrella, a corpulent one, of Mrs. Gandy protruding from a carriage window, while a shrill cry, in which his name was distinguishable, and which for its sound might have been either a lamentation or an imprecation, floated through the thick, sulphurous, circumambient air. Most probably what Mrs. Gandy said was an anathema, rather than an expression of tender regret, judging from the equanimity with which she composed herself in her seat, her demeanor indicating no tender solicitude as to the fate, in a railway sense, of Gandy. On flew the train, and anon Mrs. Gandy began to observe that the tunnel was not so bad after all. It was by no means perpetual. A stoppage took place in a few minutes, and immediately afterwards it was observable that the train was passing through a pleasant suburb, the houses being all of a villa-like character, and then through grassy fields and trim hedgerows, and what would have been leafy trees in the pleasant summer-time. It had just begun to occur to Mrs. Gandy that all this was not very suggestive of the Edgware Road, as that region is comprehended in the course of the Metropolitan Railway, when the train again stopped, and she was witness to a phenomenon, for a railway porter actually called out distinctly, "Hendon." Mrs. Gandy had entered a Midland Railway train. The situation was, in a domestic sense, and having reference to Mr. Gandy, appalling. The railway had put asunder those whom matrimony had joined together, and there pressed on Mrs. Gandy's mind an idea, which was common with her, of Gandy's utter helplessness and childish inaptitude for taking care of himself when absent from her side, which, like most mistaken beliefs, was one of the strongest in her mind. In the very torrent and whirlwind of her rage and apprehension, Mrs. Gandy had just common sense left to see that her first act must be to leave the train, and, having, as she found, an hour to wait, she ensconced herself in a corner of the waiting-room, in an attitude and with an air which did not suggest a recollection of patience on a monument. At that hour of the day there were few passengers to or from Hendon, so that Mrs. Gandy was able to watch the movements of a man who had sole possession of the platform, up and down which he paced with an irregular step and a certain irritability of gesture. His appearance was strange in the extreme, tall, thin, even to emaciation, haggard in feature, with a complexion which might be called pale muddy. Long, grizzled, unkempt hair hanging down to his shoulders and mixing with a beard and whiskers of preposterous proportions, so that all his capillary developments combined to make up one hideous and eccentric chevelure. His eyes rolling wildly, while a perpetual half-smile was flickering on his lips, so that some straggling teeth were just visible through an aperture in his beard made by the slight opening of his mouth. His clothes hung loosely on his form, and had a peculiar appearance, as if he had fallen into a river with them on him, had been dragged out by means of one of those terrible hooks which the Humane Society keeps for fishing people out of the water, and had dried his garments without taking them off by the simple process of walking several miles in the sun. In short, if ever there was such a thing as an English fakir, even in such an aspect would he most probably have appeared. Presently his eye fell on Mrs. Gandy as she by the fire sat disconsolate, and as the fakir, however cold and withered his appearance, was of a specially sociable disposition, as evidenced by an irrepressible desire to talk to everyone whom he came near, he at once made up to the lonely female, and inquired the cause of her palpable dejection. He spoke with so much volubility, and with so strange an accent, after inquiries enabled Mrs. Gandy to ascertain that he was a Northern Irishman and had been a Quaker, that he was scarcely intelligible, but enough was understood by Mrs. Gandy to enable her to state her sorrow and ask advice. The very practical suggestion that she should return to the station where she had left her husband was at once made by the fakir, but the lady was racked with doubts as to whether he was there. She had no confidence that Gandy would not make an effort to get to the Edgware Road station by himself, and of course be lost in some way or the other, baby as he was. Then she was tortured by the idea that he would, by an unwanted flash of inspiration, discover the train that she had gone by, would enter the next that went, she learned from inquiring, on the Great Northern, which, of course, would not run to Hendon, and would be whirled by one long stage to Peterborough. Even if he were wise enough to follow the very best rule for people to adopt when they miss each other, namely, to quietly wait at the spot at which the separation occurred, and remain at the Farringdon station, what might he not be doing? Conception here failed her, and a cold horror began to creep over her sensibilities. The fakir gazed with grim benevolence on the troubled woman, and, with a gentleness akin to that which might be expected from a grizzly bear in a melting mood, sought to soothe her, and offered her any assistance in his power. He soothed her fears, and she was calm, and told her tale, the burden of which was, "Where is Gandy?" The countenance of the fakir lighted up, and in language which certainly was not to be expected from such a being as he looked, a sort of washed-out Galileo, he exclaimed, "Ma'am, you have come to the right shop. I can tell you anything you want to know. I am a medium, and Mr. Home is my immediate master and manipulator." Not much did this convey to Mrs. Gandy's intelligence, beyond the fact that this strange man could in some way tell her what she wanted to know, and so she eagerly begged that he would give her the promised information. His reply was odd, for he said, "Whom would you like to summon? Mr. Gandy's mother, or the Duke of Wellington?" Still Mrs. Gandy was obtuse, but at length she was made to comprehend that in a few moments she might, if she liked, be in communication with the spirit of anyone deceased whom she should choose. To say that there was no taint of terror in Mrs. Gandy's feelings when she fully understood that she was in company with a magician who could call spirits from the vasty deep and make them answer when he called would be untrue. But her prevailing sensation was contemptuous incredulity, as evidenced by the exclamation, in no measured tones, of the one word, "Bosh!" Fierce at the implied insult to his character and powers, the fakir pressed for compliance, and Mrs. Gandy at length, in a defiant manner, said, "Do it, if you can." The demeanor of the medium, which had hitherto been airy and genial, although awkward and slightly rough, changed, and a solemnity and abstractedness came over him as, apparently after some mental exercise, he gave 3 distinct raps on the table which stood in the room. There was a pause sufficiently long, as he supposed, to give time to a spirit to wing its flight to earth from another world, and then, beneath the table, apart from which the fakir then stood, came 3 as distinct raps as he had given on its top. There came a sudden revulsion on Miss Gandy's incredulity, and her characteristic boldness was merged in fear, and ere the medium could address her, in order to obtain from her dictation the questions he was to put to the spirit, she fainted. She was roused by the loud voice of a porter, saying something which might mean that a train was going somewhere, and, with an effort, she was enabled to get into a carriage which was to convey her back to Farringdon Street, and to Gandy, as she hoped. To this day Mrs. Gandy is not sure whether her encounter with the medium was a reality or only a phantom of her brain whilst she slumbered by the fire. But if she was under the influence, there are some persons who must have often dreamed of meeting somebody who answers the description here given of the medium under circumstances which give assurance of his being not only an actual living being, but a special eccentricity. All this while Mr. Gandy was calmly seated on a hard bench at the station from which his wife had been carried away, employing himself first in watching, and, be it said, rather ogling the pretty girl who had attracted his attention, and, when she had departed in a train the destination of which was a southern suburb, he contentedly subsided into a dozy perusal of a newspaper. Thus, in an attitude which betokens content, and an irrefragable sense of belief in Mrs. Gandy's capability of turning up at some time or another, was he found when that anxious matron arrived, and was landed without mishap at the station from which she had departed an hour and a half before. She did not scold Gandy. She did not spitefully attribute to him her misadventure. Her heart was softened. She had missed the man. She had gone near to mourn for him. She had a slight taste of the feeling which would come over her if Gandy had left her and the world forever. Perhaps, too, the influence of the medium was upon her. So she met him affectionately, and seemed satisfied that he had been in his usual state of harmlessness while she had been absent from him. The next thing to be done was to get to their destination. It was yet early. There was still time for a walk, which Mrs. Gandy had promised herself in a certain region, which was, to her mind, a sort of social empyrean, and so due preparation was made once more to assay a seat in an Edgware Road train. They were still, however, on the wrong platform. Presently, from citywards came driving in a train, which stopped with the engine westward, and all indications of its proceeding whither the Gandys were to go. Seats having been secured, there was a considerable interval and much shouting of guards and porters before the train moved off. Neither of the Gandys perceived that its motion was backwards, according to their exigencies, instead of forwards, and so they took no heed. A stoppage at a cramped and dingy station, more shouting, and off went the train again. In another moment it was crossing the river, to the great bewilderment of the Gandys, who were, however, for the time, helpless, and besides, Mrs. Gandy was drowsy, and at that moment was half asleep, while Gandy, if fully conscious that another blunder was committed, was perhaps maliciously willing to give another shake to the sense of infallibility which was the main feature of the character of his intolerant spouse. So he let her sleep on until he thought the joke had been carried far enough, which was as far as Clapham Junction, and whence he calculated that, with care and good luck, they would still be able to depart in such time as to be enabled to reach the residence of the late Mr. White at 6 o'clock. He awakened Mrs. Gandy, who stared around when she found herself standing on a narrow platform, one of perhaps 60, surmounted, though not covered, by a slight roof supported by thin posts, giving them the appearance of an East Indian bungalow, with all the walls which make it a house removed, and which seem to have been shuffled and then thrown broadcast over what might be called a blasted heath in more senses than one. These skeleton buildings afforded no shelter from rain, and were constructed so as to be pervious in a peculiar degree to every wind, blow from what quarter it would. About and around them was a widespread network of iron rails, crossing, recrossing, bisecting, trisecting, and every possible secting each other. Far as the eye could reach, on every side that you turned, were lines of railway stretching out into infinite space, and on 2/3 of them at least there were at the same moment trains flying, as it were, at each other in a common centre, suggesting ideas of pictures one has seen of armour-clad knights urging their horses in full career against each other. Wan, heavy-eyed, and apparently distracted porters were seen, some rushing, some wandering slowly from shed to shed, but all not only sparing, but seemingly incapable of speech. The men were dazed. To Mr. and Mrs. Gandy, inquiring their way to a place in the sinuous congeries of stations, whence they might once more seek their destinations, one porter, less dizzy than his fellows, pointed with his finger to what seemed like the opening of a well, which had been tossed up out of the perpendicular by an earthquake, and had assumed a slanting direction, and in ponderous accents uttered the word, "There." They entered, and, having descended some steps, they found themselves in the centre of a series of subterranean passages which diverged in every direction, and rivaled the rails above in their complicity and multiplicity. Generally, the vaults, for such they were, reminded Mr. Gandy, dimly and in a very unsatisfactory manner, of a day when he got a tasting order, and spent some hours in the docks where wine is stored, hours joyous and exhilarating, but which were terribly reacted on by a night of horrors, with Mrs. Gandy in a fierce reproachful mood. There were inscriptions on the walls, which were presumed to be intended to indicate the ways to different trains, but they only served to make confusion worse confounded. Mrs. Gandy wished to go one way. Mr. Gandy, who was beginning to feel a sense of being master of the situation, insisted on going another, and at length, in the midst of a tiff, how was not readily to be explained, they separated and began an individual wandering along the interlacing dungeon-like corridors in search of each other and of their special ticket place. What befell Mrs. Gandy was never known, but as regarded Mr. Gandy, this happened. In his devious course he chanced to leave the level underground pathways and ascended some steps which brought him out into part of a platform, beside which was an exceptional, because a closed-in, structure. Through its half-open door there gleamed ruby and green wine-glasses and bottles and decanters and plated tea-urns and all the ramshackle paraphernalia of a railway refreshment-room. Gandy was fatigued, thirsty, and the thoughts of the day at the docks with a tasting order had suggested a desire for a stimulant. He approached the counter. One of the neat-handed Phyllises approached to her post of ministering angel when, powers eternal, Gandy beheld the very pretty girl who had made him, metaphysically and momentarily, a traitor to the wife of his bosom. She was a typical specimen of her class, auricomous, ultra-chignoned, fair of complexion, neat of figure, becomingly dressed, and altogether pleasant to behold, unless, indeed, some too fastidious eye fell upon her hands, which were a little stumpy and red, the nails the very opposite of almond-shaped, and just in the very slightest mourning. Her manner was what may be called technical, peculiar to her calling, combining a willingness to be admired with a sharpness and watchfulness which implied a habit of standing at bay to compliments. The voice was pleasant, but with an indication that it could be shrill and cutting, while her language betokened some culture, except that if she asked what kind of sandwich you preferred, she invariably said, "'Am or beef, sir?" Let it not be too curiously inquired into how it came about that in 5 or 6 minutes Gandy was to be seen in a remote corner of the room, leaning very far over the counter, looking into the eyes, which were nice eyes, of the pretty girl, and murmuring in a manner which suggested there might have been a time when he was a gay deceiver. The situation might have grown critical, but fate, in the shape of Mrs. Gandy, intervened, for that lady had by this time also found her way to the outlet by which Gandy before her had reached the refreshment-room. A glance was enough. She understood all, though that all was really not much. She was unaware that so far as Gandy and the pretty girl were concerned, there were antecedents, for she did not know that he had been attracted by her at the Farringdon station. For a moment she was under the influence of that temper which ere now had caused her to adopt the species of tongue punishment which is called, in the vernacular, blowing up. But somehow her spirit was subdued. Her mistakes and mishaps had depressed her. She had not quite got over the feeling which she experienced, and which had overcome her, when at the Hendon station she thought of an eternal separation from Gandy. In some sort she felt desolate, and, most of all, as a wanderer about Clapham Junction, she felt utterly helpless. Thus it happened that, when Gandy heard her voice calling on him, and he started away from the pretty girl as if she had been a serpent, and turned toward his wife, instead of meeting the upbraiding of her angry eye, he saw her with a chapfallen expression of countenance, altogether so subdued and meek that she could only falter out in trembling accents, "Oh, Gandy, can you get me away from this dreadful place?" The taming of Mrs. Cruiser was nothing to this. For once, and doubtless only for a time, Gandy, no longer a lodger in his own house, was the head of his family. With a briskness and alacrity, and with a capability of penetrating the mysteries which seemed to come to him by intuition, he took tickets for the Waterloo station, and led his wife, nothing loth, to the right point of departure. Their luck had changed. A train was, as it were, awaiting them. In a time to be counted by minutes, the Waterloo terminus is reached. The clock of the station points to 10 minutes to 6. With a hansom cab and a swift horse, there is yet time. The fates are still propitious. Even such a vehicle is at hand. On, On, the goal is nearly reached. They are within a few yards. A church clock hard by begins to strike. They are now in the narrow lane leading up to Old White's house, but there is a wagon blocking the way in front, and the hour has struck. They are too late. One theme that is definitely emerging from this series is the weird contradiction of how important the fact of marriage is, beside the seemingly completely arbitrary choice of whom to marry. Waddle is just deciding in 1 minute to marry a complete stranger, and her accepting it, and them making a date for the next day without knowing each other's names. Then he leaves and changes his mind. It's incredible. One of the main reasons I wanted to share this series with you guys this year is that I felt like even when I don't particularly like a character in this work, I find myself just riveted by this series and wanting very much to know what happens at the end. This isn't the kind of thing that will get many views, and it's a fairly odd fit for YouTube in general, but I imagine there are a handful of people who will feel the same and want to find out what happens. So, once again, we meet a fascinating background character in the form of this weird train station medium, and then he just disappears, never to be seen again. I do wish one of these sections was just devoted to one of the freakier characters. I would love to read about a day in the life of this fakir. While the description of train journeys in the story is kind of exaggerated and comedic, it is also true to this day that there are many places where train station announcements are absolutely unintelligible. As I mentioned, I'm leaving any final research on the backstory and context of the Tinsley's Christmas Annual for the final video in this series. And as you know, if you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. Tonight's confession is that I just love the vocabulary of this series. The turns of phrases are just marvelous, and almost every section has a word that is completely new to me. It's a reader's text. It's written for people who really like the act of reading itself rather than simply finding out what happens. It takes its time and it wanders a bit and touches on a number of other things before circling back to the story, and it indulges in flourishes of writing for its own sake. Some words I've particularly noticed so far are divaricatory, which refers to the action or process of spreading things apart. Traîneau, a French word, traîneau, which I can't pronounce but apparently means slow, drawling speech. Defalcations means theft or misappropriation. Mephitic, meaning foul-smelling or noxious. These are amazing words. These go in your Scrabble dictionary. I have strained my voice really badly tonight, friends, so please like, subscribe, click all the things. Thank you so much. See you in a few days.